Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Quantitative History webinar. I'm Qing Ma from Hong Kong University Business School. Today, I'm very honored to introduce our speaker, Professor Guoqi Xu, from the History Department of Hong Kong University. Professor Xu is our Kerry Group Professor in Globalization History. He is a very prestigious historian, especially in the field of Sino-foreign relations in the history. Professor Xu's research covers a wide range of interesting and fantastic topics. One of his best-known books, titled China's Olympic Dreams, introduced a very interesting history of the century-long history of China's pursuit of the Olympic game. So by this, you can find the importance of sports in the history of China's diplomatic relationship and the engagement in global politics. And more recently, Professor Xu has published another fantastic book about the Chinese laborer in the European battlefield during the First World War. It reveals the importance of China in the global politics in the early 20th century. Today, Professor Xu will introduce a very novel story about two persons, one from America living in China, and the other is a Chinese who taught in the Harvard University in the 19th century. So from these two individuals' stories, Professor Xu will reveal to us a novel history about the relationship and the communication between the two civilizations in the 19th century. So let's welcome Professor Xu.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Ma. It's a great honor for me to share my thought on this interesting topic with all of you. Let me share my screen with you. So can you see my PowerPoint now?
Not yet.
Let me see. I guess have to share first. All right. Okay. So now you all can see my screen, right? The PowerPoint.
Yes.
Okay. Just less than 10 years ago, Henry Kissinger, the man literally was experienced or witnessed the brand new Sino-American relations for almost 40 years or 50 years, wrote a book called On China. You can see he argued in the book, China and the United States needed each other because both were too large to be dominated, too special to be transformed, and too necessary to each other to be able to afford isolation. And now, at this point, we all are seeing a terrible phenomenon happen between US and China, so-called decoupling US-China relations from trade wars to Huawei, to TikTok, to WeChat, to keep Chinese students and scholars, especially in natural sciences area, out. Then yesterday, I guess many of you watched the Donald Trump speech to the UN, literally declare war on China on the COVID-19. Also, the American government now has adopted very hostile policy on CCP. So what happened to this stage? Of course, nobody can predict the future. Everything we know is a history. So let me quote John K. Fairbank. Of course, he's a leading, or literally the dean of China study in West. So in his last book, he wrote something like this: history perspective is not luxury, but necessity. So now I guess let's return to history. So before I turn to the two very forgotten and interesting individuals, let me give you some basic background between US and China relations I call the shared historic journeys. So both the United States and China, or the Middle Kingdom, used to be special according to their own perceptions. United States, of course, until early 20th century, refused to get involved in the foreign affairs. Chinese, of course, until late 19th century, considered itself Middle Kingdom or all under heaven, or Tianxia. So both the Chinese did not have actually did not establish a foreign ministry until 1901. That just tell you something about the Chinese mindset about world orders. So the United States, as I mentioned earlier, refused to be dragged into international affairs until basically pretty much First World War. So both countries or both nations did not want to get involved in foreign affairs. So that's actually, you can see even now that both countries seems become have a large gap between each other. Historically speaking, they have a long shared journeys or shared history. Let me just even briefly speak something about the roles of China in the early American history. Several years ago, or 4 years ago, in 2016, we all were obsessed with the so-called British. The Great Britain tried to split with the EU. A long time ago, actually 244 years ago, the United States actually was the first country tried to exit from Great Britain. I call it a Mexit. So actually, the one of many background for United States to try to be independent from UK is something to do with China market. The certain colonies in the Northern America was quite actually fed up with a British monopoly on China trade. That's one of several major motivations for Americans to be independent. Well, I think even basically for those of you who pay attention to the American history, we all are familiar with the Boston Tea Party in 1763. The tea, by the way, that the future Americans would dump to the ocean from China. So as soon as the United States became independent, so the first thing that they did was to basically to have a China trade. So in 1784, we all know this very well. They sent the first ship to China. The ship, by the way, I put the name on the screen, called Empress of China. Actually, they made the first trip in the new under the so-called the flag of a new United States. The trip was very profitable, at least 25 to 30% profit margin. So that just tell you basically how United States tried to benefit from its independence, then basically try to establish its own connection or close relationship with the Chinese. So when the founding fathers tried to be independent, to create a brand new political system, one of them called Benjamin Franklin. For those of you, if you're familiar with a $100 US bill, you see that Benjamin Franklin's photo is on that $100 US bill. So he was one of a very influential founding fathers. He basically even argued at that time before the United States finalized its political system, he even suggested United States might try to learn something from Confucian civilization, otherwise from China. He had a very high opinion of Chinese civilization or Chinese cultures. Benjamin Franklin was not alone. George Washington, the first president of the United States, of course, a very important founding fathers of the United States. He was shocked when somebody told him the Chinese were not white people. He always assumed the Chinese was so brilliant, was supposed to be white race. So now that's a background. So now let's turn to two largely forgotten figures, one American and one Chinese. Unfortunately, both a man, both died very young, and both of them died at a foreign country. The Chinese died at age of 45, while the American died at age 49. Both of them were not familiar with the host country's languages. The Chinese died as a Harvard professor or teacher, while the American died as a Chinese top diplomat. Although largely forgotten, I will argue they should be treated as important figures in the history of Sino-American relations. So the first individual I would like to discuss with you is by name Anson Burlingame. So who is Anson Burlingame? Anson Burlingame was born in 1820, then died in 1870. He was a graduate of Harvard Law School. He practiced law in Massachusetts, then later on served in the American House of Representatives for 6 years. So for the short period for him to serve in the American Congress, he became instant American hero. In 1856, a congressman from South Carolina by name Preston Brooks actually marched to the Senate chamber, then basically used his cane to beat the senator from Massachusetts by name Charles Sumner, literally almost to death. So that's a barbaric attack. So Burlingame was very angry, then made the most, according to New York Times, the most celebrated speech in the American Congress. The speech is titled Defense of Massachusetts. So in the speech, Burlingame denounced Brooks' barbaric assault. So basically, I put several sentences on the board for his speech. Basically, he literally said, I denounce it in the name of a sovereignty of Massachusetts, which was stricken down by the blow. I denounce it in the name of humanity. So that, of course, make Burlingame quite a household hero, especially later on when Mr. Brooks challenged him for a duel. Burlingame made the proposal, say he will be delighted to accept the duel with 2 conditions. One, the duel will take place on the Canadian side near the Niagara Falls. Then the weapon will be rifle. So the congressman from South Carolina, Mr. Brooks, chickened out. He did not dare to cross the northern states to travel to Canada. Also, he got the impression Mr. Burlingame was quite good with rifles, so he could be killed. So that make Anson Burlingame an American hero, especially for northern states after 1856. He was in 1860, he was deeply involved in Lincoln's presidential campaign. So he was so involved in the presidential campaign to elect President Lincoln, then he lost his own bid to return to the Congress. As a reward, Lincoln, the new president of the United States, decided to reward him as a minister or top diplomat to Austria in 1861. So Burlingame was happily on his way to Europe. When he arrived in Paris, he got the word the Australian government refused to accept him as a top diplomat from US because Anson Burlingame got involved in supporting some so-called nationalist revolutionary activities against Australian Empire. So he was in Paris. Then he cannot go to Austria. Then his boss, Secretary of State Henry Seward, made a surprising offer to him. See, do you want to go to China instead? He said, Anson Burlingame again said yes. So I put one sentence from his letter to Secretary of State. I proceed to my new post with a diffidence, but still with a pleasure for it. There is a fine field, and I'm yet a young man, because at that time he was 41 years old. He did not know anything about China. He never prepared to go to China as a top diplomat. But when he arrived in China, actually, the US and China has some, or shared some strikingly, or so-called, I call that 内忧外患, or troubles from within and threat from without for both countries. So in the United States, the reason I mentioned Mr. Brooks actually attacked Sumner from Massachusetts, because from 1850s, the southern states and the northern states reached their point basically cannot be breached. So there was civil war. So in 1861, when Burlingame was on his way to China, the United States was in the bloody, or the bloodiest war or civil war in US. Surprisingly, in China, that's another kind of civil war. We all know it's called Taiping Rebellion. Taiping Rebellion actually took place in 1850s, just like southern states reached the point to be split from northern states. So in 1861, the civil war or Taiping Rebellion was so serious, China not only could be, or the Great Qing Empire could lose the mandate of heaven, the Confucian civilization could be in danger, because we all know the Taiping Rebellion, or the leaders of Taiping Rebellion, especially Hun Xiuqian, he tried to create a Christian kingdom in China, but declare war or total war on Confucian civilization. So that's what you can say. Both countries at that time, as I mentioned in the beginning, declare it was special. Both of countries did not want to get involved in the international affairs. Now both of them were in the bloody civil war. So that's one shared historical background. Another shared, actually, surprisingly, the shared historical background. The both nations had the same enemy. So in 1840s, with the Opium Wars, the Great Britain and some other European countries, of course, became a major threat to China, or threat or from without. Surprisingly for United States, when United States had civil war, Great Britain was very excited to create so-called two China, the two Americas. So they would like to divide US into two. So with a strong support or open support to the Confederate government or the southern states, was so much so Great Britain even actually built up some military or naval ships for Great Britain, for the southern states. One of them, the cruisers, was called Alabama. Alabama was, the cruiser had done enormous damage to the northern states. Then eventually after Civil War was over, American government actually sent the huge bills to the British government called Alabama claims, with a threat if a United States, if a United Kingdom or Great Britain refused to have a compensation for the losses the northern states sustained, the United States would take over Canada. That's why Canada immediately became sort of semi-independent in 1871. So so that's a lot, again, a surprising shared history. So United States and China had the same enemy, Great Britain. So when Burlingame arrived in China, by the way, that also is a very unique in Chinese history, because before 1861, the Chinese did not allow any foreign diplomat to reside in Beijing permanently. So that makes Burlingame the first ambassador or diplomat from US in Beijing, the first one, because that's the Great Qing Empire was defeated in 1860 with a joint military fighting from UK and France. They marched to the military forces from UK and France, marched to the Forbidden City. They burned down the Summer Palace, then forced the Qing Empire or Qing Court to allow foreigners or foreign diplomats to live in the capital in the permanent base. So Burlingame arrived in Beijing just in that time as the first American top diplomat to reside in Beijing. So when United States was in, when Burlingame was in Beijing to represent the United States, so United States again did not have a widespread interest in China because, as I mentioned earlier, United States did not care about international affairs or including China at that time. So did not cover, unlike European powers like Great Britain, like France or like Russia, had a widespread interest in China. United States surprisingly did not have too much. So as soon as he arrived in Beijing, he decided to practice so-called cooperative policy with China and everyone. First of all, United States was weak. Secondly, United States did not have a widespread interest. So Burlingame decided to become to play a good boy, a good man, a good cop in China. So because United States was in the Civil War, by the way, also very few people noticed the fact China was one of the few nations in the world to openly and actively support American government in its Civil War or Lincoln's administration. I mentioned earlier that Alabama, the ship built by Great Britain, which did enormous damage to northern states. So in early 1864, Burlingame communicated with the Chinese government or Zhenyi Yamen, asked Chinese government to keep Chinese waters or China waters off limit for the Confederate cruisers. So Zhenyi Yamen was so happy to accept or to do something to support the United States. They issued a decree to all the governors in China. So I put that the translation of that decree on the screen. So all governors generals and governors of the maritime provinces should enjoin all local authorities to keep a careful and close oversight if the steamer Alabama or any other vessel of war from the Confederate States scheming how it can endure American property approach the coast of China under their jurisdiction, they are to prevent all such vessels from entering our port. So Mark Twain, at that time, he was a reporter for for some American newspapers, wrote at that time, say China became the very first of all foreign governments to do us a friendly justice and say to the Alabamas of Confederacy, China has no favors for rebels. So that just tell you something is how the Chinese Americans had some quite surprisingly or shared of friendship or historic background. So when Burlingame was in China, on one hand, he pursued the cooperative policy or friendly policy with China. Also, he was very busy to cultivate or so-called the cultural relationship between the Chinese Americans. I put the fans here. That fans, by the way, it's a poem in Chinese from very famous American so-called national the poet Longfellow. So Burlingame. Let me before I turn to the Burlingame first about this poem. Let me say something about Thomas Wade. He was a British diplomat in China. Later on, became a distinguished professor in UK. So he, at that time, when he was in China, he tried to practice Chinese. So he translated Longfellow's very famous poem into Chinese. Then asked one of high Chinese official by name Deng Xun. You can see his name on to basically to revise it. So Deng Xun happily did so. Then when Burlingame actually told Deng Xun he might return to US for brief visit, was said Longfellow. So Deng Xun, the Chinese official, actually put that poem in Chinese on the fan, then sent this fan to Longfellow through Burlingame. So for those of you, if you go to Longfellow House, which is not far from Harvard campus, you can see the fan there. That's the picture I took several years ago when I was visiting the Longfellow House. So Burlingame was very busy with this to cultivate a close relationship between Chinese Americans through his so-called the soft diplomacy. Burlingame also got involved in a lot of very interesting projects, which become actually quite significant in East Asia. He basically, when the Qing Court asked Burlingame to recommend a good so-called international law books for them to read, then Burlingame recommended American a scholar by name Henry Wheaton's book, Elements of International Law, called, when it's translated to Chinese, called 万国公法. So Burlingame recommended this book. They also recommended a lot of American by name W.A.P. Martin, or Chinese name Jung William, as a translator. So this book turned out to be the first book to be translated into Chinese officially under the Chinese emperor's sponsorship. So this book was become instrumental in Chinese history, also later on in Japan, after Meiji restoration. So Burlingame even invited his friend Mark Twain to visit China. Unfortunately, he died too young, so before Mark Twain can make the trip. So that's just a few examples I provide here to tell you how much Burlingame got involved as a top diplomat in China to cultivate good relations for the Chinese and Americans. So Burlingame, as I mentioned earlier, was in China as a top diplomat of America from 1861 till 1867, when he decided to resign to return to US. So in November of 1867, when he decided to make a farewell trip visit to Zhenli Yamen, he got the surprise offer from the Chinese government. Then the Zhenli Yamen asked him to represent China as a China's so-called messenger to the world. Because the reason why the Qing Court need to have somebody or to send its first diplomatic mission abroad was that in 1858, the Qing Court was forced to sign a treaty with European powers called the Treaty of Tianjin, or Tianjin Treaty. In that treaty was signed in 1858. That's one clause there, say within 10 years, the Chinese government had to send its diplomat abroad to renegotiate that treaty. So by 1868, that's basically it's a time for China to send somebody abroad to deal with that clause. So at that time, the Chinese, of course, did not care about international affairs. Also, because of bizarre so-called ritual dispute between the Chinese and foreign countries, they did not want to send its own officials abroad because the so-called ritual dispute, say whether or not to curtail or not, right? Certainly, even the Chinese want to send somebody abroad, they did not have a top officials who are qualified to do so. So with Burlingame, he was friendly to China. He was willing to represent China. Also, he has done many things for China or on Chinese behalf. So the Qing Court was quite friendly or quite impressed by this American. So that's why the Zhenli Yamen had a genius idea upon American top diplomat to represent China, or as a China's top messenger to the world, actually as a de facto, Burlingame literally as a de facto head of China's first diplomatic mission abroad. So he accepted that mission, so that basically for many Americans, or for Burlingame himself, they call that perhaps the appointment represents perhaps the greatest compliment ever paid by one great nation to another. That just give you some indication how close or friendly between two countries at that time. So that's a photo. You can see official so-called Burlingame mission. So Burlingame was a person in the middle, then surrounded with Chinese officials or foreign interpreters. So that's one official portrait of Burlingame Treaty. That's another one. So Burlingame was the person who said, then the two Chinese officials, Zigang and Shen Jiagu, was accompany him to do it. So Burlingame, the first stop for him to visit, of course, was the United States. So in 1868, his mission arrived in the United States. So basically, on behalf of China, Burlingame signed a treaty with the American government, which of course became famous later on as literally as the Burlingame Treaty. That treaty was it's the first treaty China had ever signed with any foreign country. So in this treaty, which basically suggests the Americans and Chinese should be treated equally in each other's country, have the freedom to travel to each other's countries, or have a freedom to study in each other's country. So that clause or this treaty was instrumental for China. I will briefly talk about the study abroad mission soon. So that's some implications or significance from this treaty. First of all, at that time when Burlingame arrived in US, that's a widespread so-called anti-Chinese feelings with the American people. So Burlingame Treaty literally postponed the American so-called Chinese Exclusion Act for several years, because every time when American Congress tried to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act, American president say, look, the ink of the Burlingame Treaty had not yet dried yet. We cannot do that to violate the law. So that's basically postponed the Chinese Exclusion Act for several years. On the Chinese side or China side, it's a grand beginning or start of the study abroad mission. Then eventually beginning of the long so-called romance between the Chinese Americans. Let me briefly talk about that study abroad mission. Maybe very soon. So Burlingame signed the treaty with the United States. So after US, his mission arrived in London, in Paris, in Berlin, then in Russia, in St. Petersburg, Russia. But did not accomplish very much because Great Britain, France, and Russia simply refused to basically to adopt the same friendly policy which American government had with China. So eventually in February 1870, Burlingame, after almost 2 years trip on behalf of China, he was exhausted, he was worried, then he died in Russia, literally as a top Chinese diplomat. So when the news of his death arrived in Qing Court, so the Qing Court immediately gave him an honor after his death, appoint him, also honor him as a first rank of minister. That, by the way, that honor usually reserved for the princess or royal families, but this American get that honor as a first rank of minister. Then the Qing Court also gave his family about 6,000 taels to bring his body back to US. Then get as a reward for his so-called distinguished service to Chinese nation or Chinese civilization, give his family 10,000 silver taels as a so-called compensation. So for those of you, if you go to Boston, to Massachusetts, if you walk from Harvard Square about half an hour to Mount Auburn Cemetery, you will see Anson Burlingame's tomb there. Several years ago, I checked his tomb out in the summer. So literally, the Chinese paid for this burial. So that's a brave and brilliant story of Burlingame to represent both China and the United States as a top diplomat. He died, as I mentioned, literally as a Chinese employee. But even with when he died young, did not say what happened afterward. But as I mentioned, basically the legacy of Burlingame was long lasting. So let me briefly talk about his legacy. So Burlingame, of course, literally was a Chinese emperor's envoy, so-called 使臣, in his so-called letter of credence. Even he himself cannot read his name in Chinese. Also, Pu Anchen or Anson Burlingame, his a Chinese name as a Pu Anchen. We don't know who gave his that Chinese name, but that name, by the way, it sounds quite friendly to Chinese top officials. Anchen literally means, of course, peaceful subject. So the Chinese government always loved to claim certain foreign dignitaries or foreign officials as a 中国人民的老朋友, right? Chinese people's old friend. I guess very few Americans qualify as a Chinese people's old friend. If one of them could be called that, I will argue that was Anson Burlingame. So Burlingame, his legacy was, as I mentioned, was long lasting. In 1872, when Li Hunzhang and Zheng Guofan and others tried to figure out how to save the Great Qing Empire, he decided to send the Chinese student abroad to study. Then they eventually decide to send them to US. That's basically the young boys from before they made the trip to US. Because at that time, United States, by the way, as I mentioned, just recovered from Civil War, was a poor economically or weak militarily. Also, in terms of higher education, was no match with old European university like Oxford or Cambridge or Paris or Berlin universities, but largely thanks to Burlingame Treaty, also thanks to Rong Hong, a first Chinese who graduated from Yale, then Chinese, the first study abroad mission will end up in US. So that's compared to the first trip. Now you can see after they arrived in US, they immediately transformed themselves as a quite westernized by playing baseball. Then that's another photo. The one American, one Chinese actually even was instrumental in help Yale college to defeat Harvard in 1880 with a Chinese help. The person who stayed on the top of the ship was a Chinese. So basically among the 120 students who managed to arrive in US, the first prime minister of Republic of China was one of them. So that also in 2022, when Beijing Winter Olympic Game took place, I guess we all will be reminded about Zhang Tianyu, the genius Chinese engineer. He was another member of this group. When we think about the long journey of China's study abroad mission, we have to give credit to Anson Burlingame and many others. So that's basically my short story about the wonderful journey of Burlingame. Now let me switch to a Chinese person, Ge Kunhua. Who was Ge Kunhua, or who is Ge Kunhua? In the two Harvard recent president, Professor Drew Forst and the new one, Neri Bakao, when we visit China, both of them talk about Ge Kunhua, especially last year when the new president of Harvard gave us address or speech at Peking University. He emphasized the contribution or importance of Mr. Ge Kunhua I guess most of people, even including the audience in Peking University at that time, had no clue about who was this nobody or Mr. Ge Kunhua. So Mr. Ge was a contemporary of Burlingame. He was born in 1836, then died in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1882 at age 45. So he was, at that time, he failed civil service examination. Then in order to make a living, he, during the Taiping Rebellion, he served as a secretary to the Chinese Qing Court general, then actually worked for American consulate and British consulate in China. So that's why basically when he was moved to Ningbo to take up a Chinese secretary for British general consulate in Ningbo, he served a Chinese language teacher to some foreigners, including that's, by the way, for those of you, if you visit Harvard Yenching Library, at the entry to the reading room, you will see the two pictures of Mr. Ge Kunhua. The one here is one of them. So that's Ge Kunhua. So he eventually became the first Chinese teacher to teach in American higher education. So before we turn to his experience at Harvard, let me talk very briefly about so-called Western China-related studies in 1870s. The China studies in the Western countries, with the exception of maybe France, did not really exist in 1870s. France was the only exception, had a long tradition to study Chinese history, philosophy, or sinology. So United States and Great Britain did not care very much about China-related studies until 1870s. So Oxford University or Cambridge University, or two oldest or influential universities in UK, just start to set up China chairs in their university in 1876 or around. So in that time, Berkeley is the first American university try to create a chair on China studies to teach Chinese language. Then did not work that out. Yale eventually turned that out into a reality. So so before I turn to the Yale's plan to create a China chair, let me return to another extraordinary American by name S. Wells Williams. Mr. Williams spent 43 years in China. He came to China in 1833, then did not return to US until 1876 when he was too old with a poor health. So he has a lifetime ambition to become a professor at Yale University. So in 1876, after he returned to US, so Berkeley tried to hire him as a professor at Berkeley, but he really would like to stay at Yale, at New Haven. Then in 1877, Yale finally created a position for him as a chair for him. But unfortunately, Yale did not raise any funding, cannot pay him. So, so Williams complained, saying that the chair was there, but with no cushion. So, but anyway, he became the first professor in US university to teach Chinese, but he ended up has no student at Yale. So because at that time, most American students were not interested in learning Chinese language, also because the elective system or elective course system at Yale, so very few students eventually signed up for his course. So he has 0 student at Yale. So when he was at Yale, he finished basically to revise his a major book called The Middle Kingdom. That edition was published first in 1848, which established himself as a major scholar on China. So that so the revised version was published when he was a Yale professor at 1883, 50 years after his arrival in China. So that's a Yale. So in 1877, Harvard decided to have to create its own China studies or to create its own position to teach Chinese. So at that time, the Harvard president by name Charles W. Eliot, he was the president of Harvard from 1869, then did not resign until 40 years later in 1909. He basically, Harvard was transformed into a major university under his leadership. He basically met Anson Burlingame when Burlingame was representing China in the United States. So in 1877, that a very rich or successful merchant or businessman from Boston by name Francis Knight, he sent a letter to Harvard President Eliot, volunteered to raise funding, $10,000 to create a chair at Harvard to teach Chinese. Then Eliot was quite happy to accept that offer. So Mr. Knight eventually did not raise enough or $10,000 as he promised. He eventually raised about less than 900,000. So actually the major hurdle for him is not the money, it's basically to find somebody from China to teach at Harvard. Because he, first he communicated with a powerful Chinese politician, Mr. Li Hunzang. I showed his photo earlier. Asked Li Hunzang to recommend some Chinese to do so. Li Hunzang simply tell him the Chinese do not want to go there. Nobody was interested in visiting US, so you choose your, basically find your own teacher. Then in desperation, he turned to the third person on the board, Edward Drew. He was a Harvard graduate. He worked at the Chinese Maritime Customs, so at Ningbo. So basically, that's why he eventually discovered Mr. Ge Kunhua, because Mr. Ge Kunhua served as his Chinese language tutor. So he was impressed by Mr. Ge's open-minded approach to foreign affairs, also was quite good, effective teacher. So he recommended Mr. Ge to be appointed to teach at Harvard. When Harvard decided to hire a Chinese native to teach Chinese, that created an international debate. Because as I mentioned earlier, at Cambridge, at Oxford, or at Yale, they all basically hired either missionaries or former diplomats or their own to teach Chinese. So now Harvard decided to hire native Chinese speakers to teach Chinese. So that's a major debate at that time about how to teach foreigners or Chinese. Is a Chinese native speakers are better suited to teach American student or Western China scholar to do so. So many so-called top expert on Chinese languages actually oppose Harvard approach. For example, Walter Hillier, he later on became a Chinese professor at King's College London. He basically openly opposed idea to have a native Chinese teacher to teach Americans Chinese. Robert Hart, most powerful person at that time, because he's the head of Chinese maritime custom, he basically opposed that idea as well. They say it's a not good idea. Even even Edward Drew in the beginning was not quite cool for the idea for his beloved Harvard to have a Chinese native to teach, but that's a two actually, and it's a few actually support the Harvard approach. H.B. Morse, he also graduated from Harvard at that time, worked at the Chinese Maritime Customs. He supported the idea to have Chinese teachers. He later on become a top China scholar or historian actually in the West. He influenced Fairbank actually in a very significant ways to turn Fairbank into a China scholar. So he supported the idea. W.A.P. Martin, whom as I mentioned earlier as a translator of the Wanguo Gongfa, also support Harvard idea. So that's a great debate when Harvard hired Ge Kunhua. There's another debate about how to teach, because Ge Kunhua had never taught at regular school, Also at that time, even did not have a good so-called textbooks. So the foreigners who had the experience of learning Chinese all agree the best textbook to use as was the Thomas Wade textbook called 子耳集. But that book was published in 1867, then it's out of print. So the revised edition was not available. So that's about textbook. Then even how to teach American classrooms was a big challenge. So H.B. Morse, then from US, and Walter Hillier also, and many others all offered a practical advice to Mr. Guo how to conduct classroom. So Mr. Light had all these suggestions translated into Chinese and forward that to Mr. Guo. So at that time, of course, again, the Harvard Chinese language program is a brand new in US. So to avoid the embarrassment of having no Chinese or no student to take Mr. Guo's class at Harvard, so the president Eliot actually put an ad in Boston, welcome not only Harvard student to take Chinese course, also anybody who is interested and willing to pay the annual fee, like $150, then could sign up for this. Unfortunately for Mr. Guo, during his 2.5 years of teaching at Harvard, he had about, in total, 5 students. But that's not too bad, by the way. I mentioned earlier, Williams at Yale had 0 students. Even later on, when the famous or genius language teacher, Zhou Renren at Harvard in 1920s, he basically actually mentioned that very few students take up his Chinese course either. So for the 5 students, Mr. Guo had the most devoted student was a very distinguished Harvard professor called George Martin Lane. He was so distinguished that in 1894, when he retired from Harvard, Harvard actually created the pension for him. That's the first Harvard professor qualified to receive the pension from university. He was a very famous professor of Latin. He was very, very excited to sign up the Chinese language course with Mr. Ge Kunhua. So Mr. Guo actually gave him a Chinese name, Liu En. Even wrote many poems for him. So when Mr. Ge Kunhua was in United States, he did not speak English in the beginning. He tried to learn, but was still not fluent. But he made a long-lasting impact at Harvard campus or broadly the American community. C.C. Everett, the dean of Harvard Divinity School, actually had a very high opinion of Mr. Ge Kunhua, literally called him, because of Mr. Ge Kunhua, he basically re-educate Americans about the glory or brilliant nature of Chinese civilization or Chinese high culture, or even about that a Chinese gentleman like Mr. Guo. Remember when Mr. Ge Kunhua died in 1882, American Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. So basically the American society basically says the Chinese were barbaric, was not civilized. But Mr. Ge Kunhua, with his presence, with his colorful nature, with his devotion to his teaching to Chinese civilization, to the Chinese high culture, he really opened up American and this Harvard community's eyes. So that's why the dean of Harvard Divinity School had a very high opinion of him. So Mr. Guo basically literally served as Burlingame as a messenger to the West on behalf of China. Ge Kunhua served as a messenger to Americans and American civilization on behalf of China too. So basically he did not speak English very much. So he was so eager to share his so-called love of Chinese poems. So anytime when he see a quite interesting occasion, he would compose a Chinese poem, then ask his son to translate into English for Americans, So I put one example of his poem there he composed for American woman that states the translation, by the way, was less elegant as his original Chinese, but he basically presented as a gift to an American woman, then with a comment say this is a token of friendly regard, lacks nothing of gracefulness. So Ge Kunhua was very open-minded, very eager to get involved in American society. He got in touch with Williams, the Yale professor, with a Longfellow, with everyone. He liked to interact with him. So that basically, that's like the name card Ge Kunhua himself made for him. He wrote many poems for Americans. This is one poem he composed for Mr. Williams, the Yale professor. Then he wrote several poems for the famous American poet Longfellow. Longfellow's poem I mentioned earlier was the first poem was translated into Chinese. So Ge Kunhua got in touch with him. So that you can see his poem for Longfellow. He at that time when he was at Harvard, he really tried to publish a collection of his poems. Unfortunately, before he finished that, he died. So, but you can find that unfinished manuscript at Harvard Library, Wharton Library. So, Longfellow himself also present his own picture to the Ge family as a gift. Then he really, Ge Kunhua, because of his very interesting personality or his open-minded nature, he won many admirers and personal friends in US in short time. So his success was unique in the era of widespread anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States. So when he died, actually Harvard community was heartbroken. So on February 16th, 1882, Harvard actually held a memorial service for him at the Harvard Yard. The president of Harvard, Yale, and the dean of a divinity school or dignitaries from Harvard, other places, or including his favorite student, distinguished Harvard professor Liu En or Mr. Lane were there. So the dean of Harvard Divinity School gave a eulogy. So basically, in this eulogy, that's a very long eulogy. So I put the one short paragraph here. You can see how he literally Mr. Ge Kunhua, according to Everett, single-handedly promoted the Chinese civilization to the level was highly respected by his admirers and followers. So they admit the standard of Confucius is higher than that of most Christian lives as we contemplate the life of this representative of faith in the form of so unlike ours. Well, may hope that we may be as faithful to our own ideas as he was to his. So, so after he died, Harvard to show his appreciation to his contribution, just like a Chinese Qing Court did generously to Anson Burlingame. Harvard established a trust fund in amount of $5,000 US for Mr. Ge Kunhua's children's education or for his survivors' living expenses. $5,000 US, by the way, at that time was a big money, very significant amount. Also, Mr. Drew took personal responsibility for returning his body and family back to China, just like a Qing Court paid to bring Anson Burlingame's body back to US. So now we all heard about the stories about Confucius Institute. Ge Kunhua literally, as a one man, contributed enormously, maybe achieved many or hundred Confucius Institute failed to accomplish. So in other words, this gentleman even was forgotten by almost everyone, was very important in the so-called shared history or between the Chinese or Americans. I guess I was instructed to stop within 1 hour. So let me briefly summarize what I said. So basically, before the current development between China and US, that's a very unpleasant. So there was a long and exciting shared history between the Chinese and Americans. The examples of two gentlemen, one from US, one from China, I hope convey to you how deeply rooted of each other's so-called shared journey. The Chinese, of course, contribute enormously to the United States national development. So was Americans to China. Give you one example. After United States recovered from Civil War, the first railway which connected the West Coast to East Coast, called the Trans-Pacific Railway, literally was built by the Chinese. Of course, last year was a 150 years anniversary of the completion of the railway, which of course was significant for US. Nobody give credit to the real Chinese railway builders who sacrificed their life to turn US into what it is today. So how to understand Sino-US history or the reality in the shadow of current decoupling? That of course in the past we talk about 藤床异梦, same bed, different dreams, or the Chinese for its 2008 Olympic Games called the slogan "One World, One Dream." Now, of course, with the decoupling, that means even not the same bed anymore, even definitely with different dreams. So I guess, again, as I mentioned earlier, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I guess history could serve as a guidance for us. As a Asian Chinese said, 前事不忘，后事之师. Those who do not forget the past will be masters of the future. Then another Chinese saying called 求同存异, to seek agreement and shared values and leave the disagreement to be dealt with later. So, so that's, again, I hope, let me just stop here. So I'm hoping that basically I have that Chinese saying called 抛砖引玉. I have threw out a lot of breaks at you. So hopefully you can hit back with a jade. All right, thank you. Let me stop the sharing. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Xu, for your fantastic talk and the introduction of this amazing history in the 19th century. Well, now it's our discussion session. Today, we are very honored to invite Professor Richard Hu from University of Macau as our special discussant. Professor Hu was ever our Hong Kong U colleague. He is now the distinguished professor in politics and public policy in the University of Macau. Meanwhile, he is also the dean of the Faculty of Social Science in the University of Macau. So now, Professor Hu, please use 10 or more minutes to give some comments on Professor Xu's talk.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ma, for your invitation. And we just heard an excellent presentation from Professor Xu on two interesting persons' stories, one from US, one from China. I want to make three observations to share with audience. First, the stories of these two persons are very interesting to me. For Anson Burlingame, when I first heard the name when I was undergraduate student, I was taking 近代中国外交史, so heard about Pu Anchen. So now today I heard a full story from Professor Xu. Now for Ge Kunhua, this is the first time I heard that. but I was at Harvard as Orlan Fellow in 1991. I remember I visited Yanjing Library many times. I saw that picture on the wall, but I didn't know the name until today. I heard the story from Professor Xu. So both person, I think it should be important figures for China-US and all for China-US relations. So they are important figures. And although the two person, Burlingame maybe received quite well treatment in China because he was a diplomat and also envoy representing China. So the reception and treatment was much better. But for the other person, Mr. Ge, you know, you can imagine under that environment, you know, treating Chinese as a barbarian, excluding Chinese from America's social environment. Harvard gave him such a dignified treatment, treat him as a scholar, as a teacher. I think that's something wonderful. I think that shows the two society need these kind of person as, you know, you can say agent of change or envoy of culture or whatever, old friends in Chinese, 老朋友. So they I think, played their due roles in promoting the relationship. So they are part of the history of the, you know, between US and China. So that's my first point. The second point, I want to, you know, follow up on what Professor Xu have touched on. What is the takeaway message for these two-person story? And then he allude us to the key words that shared history between US and China. I think that's a very important term, shared history between US and China. What is shared history? Shared history is a part of the history, certain part of history we both made, we jointly made. Or that is something we can say we have part of the same history, right? So this two person is a good representative for making that same part of the history for the two countries. And they play the role in their position to promote whether you can say the relationship or culture exchange or make the two countries closer. You know, for Anson Chen, I think it was not Anson Chen, Anson Burlingame. I think it's a very important. He played a role even representing China to sign a treaty with US, you know, first equal treaty. And also he introduced international law ideas to China. That's wonderful, you know. And also he played a diplomatic role, lobby China to support, you know, taking side during the U.S. Civil War and against the Confederation. So that's a very big role to play. For Mr. Ge Kunhua, I think also very important. He probably was the, you know, from Professor Xu's story, he probably was the first person, native speaker, as a teacher of Chinese to the American universities. So he's a one person Confucius Institute. We all know Confucius Institute today, but he is really the very original starter of that enterprise. So I think that's wonderful. So shared history need this kind of person. Shared history is very important for the two countries. And if we forgot about our shared history, there will be no shared future. So that's the third point I want to make about Professor Xu's last slide about from the shared history to shared future. You know, today, as he beginning the talk, he was talking about the current background of US-China relations. People are talking about decoupling. Now, based on the story we heard about the shared history, decoupling is trying to decup the two countries, trying to sever the shared history. I think that will be devastating for our two countries. So I think we should learn from the history. We should oppose those politicians' attempt trying to sever this relationship. And those politicians, they are doing that for their short interest, for their short political interest. So for the long-term interest of the two countries, two people, two nations, we need to promote the shared history. And we need to, tolerate each other, even we have huge differences. We need to seek agreement, and while seeking or agree to disagree on something. And if we keep decoupling, and there will be no shared future. It is not good news for the world. It's not good news for the two countries. So I will end here. Thank you. Thank you for Professor Xu's excellent presentation.
Okay, thank you, Professor Hu. Professor Xu, would you like to make some response now?
Sure. I think should I also there's some questions here. Should I answer the 5 questions, or you want me to respond to?
So Zhichen, maybe let me make a quick comment.
Okay.
A question for Professor Xu. I think it's a very interesting comparison. On the other hand, as a social scientist, I would say, the bigger question is, what do we learn from their story, right? Because if we don't learn much, infer much lesson from the story, then, there are always many people going through their lives and so on. Of course, all the details are interesting, but if we don't learn anything, it may be anyway. So what I'm trying to say is that if we observe the asymmetry between Chinese going to work and live in the U.S. And Americans going to work and live in China, especially by the time the two stories were happening, we know there were many Americans and Europeans living in China as missionaries and spreading the gospel and many other things. So in that sense, I mean, the Chinese society by the 1870s was not was not unfamiliar, especially with foreigners living in Beijing and other relatively large cities. But then in the US, then Americans had hardly interacted with any Chinese. So this reminds me of a very similar situation observed many centuries earlier. If we go back to the 7th or 8th century, just when the Maritime Silk Road was, starting or was about to take off, there were many foreigners, especially from the Arab world, living and working in Guangzhou and other Chinese cities. But there were hardly any Chinese working and living in the Arab world or even in India, Southeast Asia. So even by the late 19th century, we still see a very similar situation or asymmetry. Almost no Chinese going overseas and really making any stronghold, whatever that means in other societies.
Okay.
So that legacy, to some extent, has carried over to today. I mean, because even though we see many Chinese workers and others living in Africa and other countries working there, but they will still live in very isolated, small sub-communities and so on. Whereas many foreigners have, really settled into the Chinese societies and penetrated in various other ways. So, so Professor Xu, what do we learn from this story of two people?
Okay, all right. So let me combine your question with Richard Hu's comments. So I think the main lesson I think we can learn from the extraordinary journeys from these two gentlemen, as Richard referred to, we should, from the shared past, we should actually create something like shared future. I think one thing by this story I can tell basically just like the Chinese societies and American society even was at that time was quite complicated. The Qing Court was very conservative, but came out with a brilliant idea to appoint Anson Burlingame as China's so-called first de facto, the head of a diplomat mission. United States was same thing because as I mentioned to you earlier, when Burlingame was in US, especially when Ge Kunhua was in US, there was widespread anti-Chinese feelings or sentiment in US. But that did not basically stop Harvard from treating Mr. Ge Kunhua with a deep respect, deep understanding. Also give you a last example. I briefly mentioned about the one of many legacies of Mr. Burlingame was a study abroad mission, right? So-called education mission. When the 120 students arrived, was in US, I showed you in the beginning, most of them did not know American culture at all, did not know English. They were kids with a dress up, even with a not only traditional Chinese clothes, even with a cues, 长袍马褂, right? 还有辫子. But as soon as they arrived, actually they flourished. Then Mr. Zhang Tianyu graduated from US, then become top engineer. Also in 18, let me give you one example about many different sides of the US society. That's one thing I think both Chinese Americans can learn or get away or take away from today's talk. I hope it's basically that's a very complicated elements of both society. In 1876, that's a centennial celebration for the American independence, right? So the Philadelphia hosts World Expo to celebrate, to mark that. Guess what Americans did to the Chinese boy student? They show off Chinese kids' achievement. President of the United States, Mr. Grant, personally shake hands with each of them. Then tell the whole world how the Chinese kids were brilliant, how they benefit from learning from American culture, how they were the best or represented the best of civilization in the world. So these kids was basically, many of them was either in some of them even was in elementary school, a few in high school, but they were deeply moved. They were, the American host families treat them enormously well. So that basically, I think one thing we learned, because today, before we give up on each other, before the decoupling, let's return to the 19th century, because at that time, China was even less open-minded, right? As I mentioned, the Chinese even did not have a foreign ministry until 1901. United States did not even want to get involved with international affairs until pretty much early 20th century. But at the same time, both Chinese and Americans actually collectively create a wonderful foundation for the future Chinese. So that's before the today talk, Professor Chen and I have a quite interesting chat, because when Burlingame was in US, basically many people, his admirers or followers in US called the representative from oldest civilization come to the newest civilization. Sometimes I will argue that that's maybe the China, of course, has the longest oldest civilization, but as a nation state, United States was an old brother to China. Remember the Republican system of China, were basically that's Chinese copied from US and France. United States this year, of course, is a 244 years history after independence. But when United States declared independence in 1776, China was in the Qing Emperor era. Now, where was the Qing Empire? Where was the British Empire? Where was the German Empire? Where was the Russian Empire? Where was Australian-Hungary Empire? Right? Where was the German or even Japanese Empire? So all this were gone by United States as a nation which created a brand new system with the first written constitution in the world, literally actually served as the institution builder for the world. So I think the Chinese today, of course, I just mentioned the two stories of two extraordinary gentlemen, but it was the United States who brought China to the United Nations as a founding member of Security Council, Permanent Security Council. That's basically the idea of American president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. So before his death, he was planning the future of the world after Second World War. He came out with a brilliant idea of 4 policemen to maintain the world order. So 4 policemen, that means 4 world orders. Which 4 world orders? World leaders, United States, Great Britain, Russia or Soviet Union, then China. So you say that's a long shared journey or shared vision, because for example, basically for the Chinese and Americans were on the same side for both world wars, the First World War and Second World War. Even during the Cold War, with a brief period between 1949 and 1969, the Chinese and Americans were quite very close. Again, as I mentioned, China and the United States faced the same enemy during the 19th centuries with Great Britain. Then, of course, China and the United States shared same enemies or same actually conviction about world orders in the First World War, in the Second World War, and even in the Cold War, right? So I think that's basically, as Richard mentioned about the shared future, or Professor Chen mentioned about the takeaway lesson from this. I think future is unpredictable, but what we have as a human being or the civilization is the past. That's why I quote the Sima Qian, 前事不忘，后事之师, right? For those of you who don't forget the past, you could be a master of the future. So if Americans and Chinese learn or pay attention to the extraordinary journeys of Anson Burlingame and Ge Kunhua, then I think we might have a great future if they can do that in 19th century. Remember, United States have a so-called slavery system, right? The 2 US at that time, the slavery system. Then China, of course, was so isolated at that time, but they came out with so-called extraordinary journeys. So we should have a bright future if we have a historic mind for politicians, for average citizens. So we can do it. So I guess that's my short answer to your brilliant comments or questions.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Xu and Professor Hu and Professor Chen's discussion. In the remaining 5 or more minutes, let me select 1 or 2 questions from our audience for Professor Xu's consideration. The first one is about Burlingame. Could you speak a bit more about the reasons why Burlingame was so successful in the United States, but much less so in Europe, particularly in Britain and France?
Okay, that's a good question. I think that's come from my colleague.
Yeah.
So, United States basically, the Chinese, by the way, at that time selects the best messenger to represent China. Anson Burlingame, he was, of course, as I mentioned, during the talk, he was a hero in the United States. He was respected. Burlingame, by the way, he was a wonderful speaker. When he started to talk, basically, he was very passionate. So when he was in US, basically, the American society, American government, American politicians, American dignitaries treat him and his mission extremely well. Never basically, like I think that's unprecedented. For example, even the president of the United States at that time was under impeachment. Chinese diplomat mission was invited to White House, has a wonderful reception. American Congress, both houses, the Senate and House of Representatives, both actually hosted receptions for them. So American media, American society was extremely excited for the fact it was American who represent China or represents oldest civilization to visit the new civilization. So that's why basically the Americans basically Burlingame was quite successful, even reached the treaty. Also, as I mentioned earlier during the talk, because United States did not have a widespread interest. United States, unlike European powers, was not interested in occupy Chinese territory, was not interested in basically at that time basically was to subject Chinese to so-called imperialism. So the reason why Burlingame was less successful in Europe, because Great Britain, of course, as which benefit from its so-called unequal treaties in China, refused to accept Burlingame's appeal, say treat China fairly, peacefully, allow that civilization to basically to develop freely. Then sooner or later they become what John the so-called family of nations, because the European powers just simply refused to treat China as a one of equals. But United States at that time was winning. That's as I mentioned, they have a lot of shared values, shared historical background, shared even actually convictions about each other, but the Europeans did not. So only actually in Europe, only one country showed some slight sympathy with the Burlingame Treaty, was a New Germany. When Burlingame arrived in Berlin, I guess many of you know that German Empire was did not exist yet. So prepare for the war with France. So the so-called new or so-called the future German Empire was showed some sympathy with Burlingame because they want to undermine its opponent like France or Great Britain. So the reason why Burlingame died so young, he was quite exhausted. He was worried. He had a high expectation for him, not only because he was paid very well. The Chinese, by the way, paid him annual salary is at least about $30,000 US. At that time, it's a huge figure. Give you some comparison when another person, actually important American who are important to China, Frank Goldenow, in 1914, when he was appointed as the president of Johns Hopkins University, his annual salary is at $10,000 US. When Fairbank was hired as a Harvard faculty member in 1936, I'm sorry, 1936, his annual salary was $5,000 US. So $30,000 US in 1860s or 70s was high. But so eventually the reception of his mission was very bad in Europe. Burlingame was deeply worried he might disappoint Chinese host, disappoint his own basically, or cannot achieve his own expectations for himself. He really want to create history there. He spoke very highly for Chinese civilization. Even he don't speak Chinese, he don't know his Chinese name was a Puanchen, right? Even he represent Chinese emperor. He never met with a Chinese emperor. By the way, Chinese emperor at that time was a boy, did not see anybody, right? So that's basically the reason why he was so successful in US. Simply because he's one of American, then United States and China, even were totally different. In many ways, they have a shared values, have a shared convictions, have a shared, expectations for the future. So.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting information. Maybe the last question. What do you think the Qing government learned from their collaboration with Burlingame? Did they conclude that the tactic of employing a foreigner to deal with foreigners was a successful one?
Of course, to appoint Burlingame for Qing Court, as I briefly mentioned during at the talk, because first of all, Qing government had to send somebody abroad because that's a requirement from Tianjin Treaty. Secondly, because at that time the Chinese refused to join the international system, also refused to follow so-called modern diplomacy, especially in terms of rituals. So by to appoint Burlingame, maybe it's the best option they had. But after Burlingame passed away or died as a Chinese envoy or employee, the Zhenli Yamen basically concluded the mission was quite successful. That's why even basically the Qing Court did not authorize Burlingame to sign the treaty on China, but the Zhenli Yamen approved that treaty. Also, the two Chinese officials spoke, Zhigang and Sun Jiagu spoke highly about Burlingame. They think this guy really represents Chinese interest to the full. So also, as I mentioned, even the Qing Court did not have any idea about study abroad program at that time or the long-term implications about, especially about the Chinese Exclusion Act in US. But with the Burlingame Treaty, as I mentioned, that postponed the passing of Chinese Exclusion Act or paved the way, the glorious or still ongoing journey of China's study abroad program. That's actually Burlingame started. With also, we all know, even today, we all actually have to pay to benefit from the education program, which benefit from Burlingame Treaty. Give you one example. Because of Burlingame Treaty, the 120 boys who not everybody returned to China. Some of them died. Somebody died actually in the war against France on behalf of China or against Japan. But the majority of them who returned to China became very instrumental to China. One of them eventually, by name Liang Chen, he was one of a boy student. In 1908, on behalf of China, he negotiated the box so-called scholarship with the American government. Then basically the study abroad program continued through the boy student, Liang Chen. Then of course, then we have a so-called the boxer scholarship. Then Mr. Zhao Renrun, Mr. Hu Shi, and many others then continued that trend. That all basically, if you, from historian perspective, when you look back, that's origin. The origin has something to do with the Burlingame. So I think basically, Burlingame was forgotten in US. By the way, the last major biography of Burlingame was published in 1912. Nobody gave credit to this guy, but now, especially today, in the background of a decoupling, we should think about. Burlingame, by the way, not only he pursued the cooperative policy with China, on behalf of China or with other countries very well, he literally was a father of the open door policy, United States. That's become official policy of United States to deal with China. at the turns of 20th century. Open door China. The one reason, by the way, China did not repeat the fate of India or many others to become somebody else colony, because open door, because basically the major powers has a so-called balance of power arrangement in China, but Burlingame supposed to get credit for this. So we should, as either from historians' perspective or from today's so-called quite sad reality between China and US, we should learn from Burlingame. We should learn from Ge Kunhua. Especially, I think the Chinese government should learn from Ge Kunhua's story too. Ge Kunhua, as a one person, he basically did enormously well. For example, I did not mention in my talk during the time, Harvard Yenchun Library, which Professor Hu visited, the first books of Harvard Yenchun Library, which of course eventually becomes the leading research library in the West on China. The first books came from Harvard through Ge Kunhua. Mr. Ge Kunhua literally not only was the first Chinese language teacher in US, he laid the foundation for the future China studies, including Harvard Yenchun Library. That's why Harvard president kept talking about him. That's why even in 1916, when Ge Kunhua died almost more than 30 years ago, the former president of Harvard, Mr. The guy who transformed Harvard, Eliot, still remind his colleague at Harvard, say, don't forget Mr. Go. He basically ended up spending on Mr. Ko, K-O. See, that's, so I think now basically, even very few people even benefit from Harvard Yenchun paid attention to Ge Kunhua. Even his photos was at the main entry to the reading room. So that's again, sometimes the significance or importance of individuals or certain events were not obvious at that time, but later on, you will see it's a significant, it's a brilliant. So so that's, I guess, that's a value of history. We can learn the lesson from history, then maybe become wiser to deal with the current situation or to create a better future.
Okay, time's up. We are sorry that we cannot cover all the questions. I found there are still many good questions. Later, we will forward all of your questions to Professor Xu for his consideration. So then thank you again, Professor Xu, for your wonderful talk. And thank you very much, Professor Richard Hu, for your discussion. Well, now let me announce the next week's event of our quantitative history webinar. Next week, we will have Professor Stephen Mora to talk about economic history of the Panama Canal. It's a talk about economic history of trade or geography. But note, next week we will have our talk on Tuesday, not on Thursday. So thank you for your continuous support to our activity, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank everyone.
Thank
you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Bye.
you, Richard.